crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound breaking the forest's eerie silence. I should have felt peace, but instead, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Maybe solo camping wasn't such a great idea after all. I'd always been an outdoors enthusiast, but life, work, and relationships had kept me away from the wilderness for far too long. When a long weekend finally lined up with a clear weather forecast, I decided to seize the opportunity. My friends thought I was crazy to go alone, but I was determined to prove I could handle it. The first day had gone smoothly enough. I'd hiked deep into the Pisgah National Forest, well off the popular trails. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a babbling brook, surrounded by towering pines. As I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, I felt a sense of accomplishment. This was exactly the kind of solitude and independence I'd been craving. As the sun began to set, I got a small fire going and heated up my freeze-dried dinner. The warm glow of the flames kept the encroaching darkness at bay, and I found myself relaxing. I pulled out my journal and started sketching the scenery around me. The forest was beautiful in the fading light, with long shadows stretching between the trees. That night, I slept soundly, lulled by the gentle sounds of the brook and the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke feeling refreshed and ready for a day of hiking and exploration. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I set out with my day pack, leaving most of my gear securely stored in the tent. The day passed quickly as I hiked along barely visible game trails, discovering hidden waterfalls and breathtaking vistas. I felt alive, connected to nature in a way I hadn't experienced in years. As the afternoon wore on, I made my way back to my campsite, looking forward to another peaceful evening by the fire. But as I approached my clearing, that uneasy feeling began to creep back in. I paused, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of place. My tent stood undisturbed, and there were no signs that anyone or anything had been through the site. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling as simple paranoia from being alone in the woods. I busied myself with camp chores, gathering more firewood and filtering water from the stream. As I worked, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every few minutes, I'd stop and look around, half expecting to see someone or something staring back at me from between the trees. But there was never anything there. As darkness fell, I got another fire going, hoping its warm light would dispel my growing unease. I tried to focus on preparing my dinner, but I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest seemed different tonight. The usual nighttime sounds felt muted, as if the woods were holding its breath. I ate quickly, no longer able to enjoy the peaceful solitude. Part of me wanted to pack up and hike out, even in the dark, but I knew that would be foolish. The trails were treacherous enough in daylight. Attempting to navigate them at night would be asking for trouble. No, I told myself I was safe for staying put until morning. After cleaning up from dinner, I retreated to my tent earlier than I had planned. I zipped myself in, feeling a false sense of security in the thin nylon walls. I pulled out my book, hoping to distract myself with a good story until I felt tired enough to sleep. I'm not sure how long I had been reading when I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere outside my tent. I froze, straining my ears. For several long moments, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. My heart began to race. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They seemed to be circling my tent. I clutched my flashlight, debating whether to shine it outside, but fear kept me paralyzed. What if it was a bear? Or worse, what if it was a person with bad intentions? The footsteps completed a circuit around my tent and then paused. I could sense a presence just outside the thin fabric wall. My mind raced through my options. Should I call out? Should I make noise to scare away an animal? Or would that just alert a potential predator, human or otherwise? to my exact location within the tent? Before I could decide, the footsteps began again, once more circling my tent. This time, they seemed closer. I could hear the leaves crunching right next to the tent wall. My breathing was rapid and shallow now, and I worried that whoever, or whatever, was out there might hear my pounding heart. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and went out. I stifled a gasp, fumbling in the dark to turn it back on. When I finally got it working again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadow on the tent wall, a large, human-shaped silhouette looming just outside. I bit back a scream, every muscle in my body tensing. The shadow remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, it began to move, continuing its circuit around my tent. I tracked its progress, turning my head to follow the shape as it moved from one tent wall to the next. When it completed the circle, the footsteps and the shadow both paused at the front of my tent, right by the zippered entrance. I held my breath, certain that at any moment, I'd hear the zipper being pulled down. But instead, after a few heart-stopping moments, the footsteps slowly retreated. I stayed frozen in place, straining my ears as the sound grew fainter. Even when I could no longer hear anything, I remained still, afraid that any movement or sound on my part might bring the mysterious visitor back. I'm not sure how long I sat there in terrified silence. It could have been minutes or hours. Every tiny sound, a leaf rustling in the breeze, a distant animal call, made me flinch. I didn't dare leave the tent, but I knew there was no way I'd be able to sleep. As the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate my tent, I finally felt brave enough to move. My muscles protested as I uncurled from my tense position. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been clenching every part of my body. Slowly, stiffly, I made my way to the tent entrance. I hesitated with my hand on the zipper, taking a deep breath to steel my nerves. Then, in one quick motion, I unzipped the tent and stuck my head out, half expecting to come face to face with my night stalker. But the clearing was empty. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of the terror I'd experienced during the night. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, if my mind had conjured up the footsteps and shadows out of simple anxiety about being alone in the woods. Still wary, I slowly emerged from my tent. The morning air was crisp, and a light mist hung between the trees. I did a slow turn, scanning the perimeter of my campsite. That's when I saw them, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the soft, dew-dampened earth around my tent, was a trail of footprints. Large boot prints circled my tent multiple times, exactly as I had heard during the night. The tracks came from the woods to the north of my clearing, circled my tent several times, and then led off to the south. My hands shaking, I knelt to examine the prints more closely. They were deep and well-defined. Whoever had made them was heavy, probably a large man. I followed the trail with my eyes to where it disappeared into the underbrush. The woods suddenly seemed very dark and foreboding, even in the morning light. I didn't even consider making breakfast or breaking camp properly. I threw my things haphazardly into my backpack, leaving the tent for last. As I was taking it down, I noticed something that had been hidden underneath, a small scrap of paper weighted down with a stone. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper. On it, in messy handwriting, was a short message. "You're lucky I wasn't hungry. Don't come back." I didn't need to be told twice. Within minutes, I had everything packed. I practically ran down the trail, uncaring of the noise I was making. It was only when I reached my car, safely out of the woods, that I allowed myself to break down, the full terror of the night finally hitting me. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what their intentions were, but one thing's for certain, I'll never go camping alone again. Some parts of the wilderness, it seems, are better left unexplored. The moment we pulled into the empty campground, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. But my kids were cheering in the backseat, and Sarah was already talking about which spot looked best. How could I tell them that every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn the car around? "Look, Dad, we have the whole place to ourselves," my son Tommy exclaimed, his face pressed against the window. I forced a smile. "Yeah, buddy, looks like we got lucky." But luck had nothing to do with it. This was the height of camping season, and Whispering Pines Campground was known for being booked solid months in advance. Yet here we were, driving past empty site after empty site, not another soul in sight. Sarah, my wife of 15 years, squeezed my arm. "This is perfect, Jack. The kids can run around without us worrying about bothering anyone." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain the dread pooling in my stomach? We'd been planning this trip for months, a chance to disconnect from our hectic lives and reconnect as a family. I couldn't ruin it based on a feeling. We chose a site near the lake, and I busied myself setting up our tent while Sarah took the kids to explore. The repetitive actions of hammering stakes and threading poles helped calm my nerves. By the time they returned, faces flushed with excitement, I had almost convinced myself that I was overreacting. "Dad, we found a perfect spot for swimming tomorrow." Our daughter, Lily, bounded up to me, her pigtails bouncing. "That's great, sweetie," I said, ruffling her hair. "But remember, we need to check the water first to make sure it's safe." As the afternoon wore on, we settled into our campsite. The kids helped gather firewood, and Sarah started preparing dinner. The normality of it all began to ease my anxiety. Maybe we really had just lucked out with an empty campground. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, that uneasy feeling returned. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. "It's so peaceful here," Sarah sighed, leaning against me as we sat around the campfire after dinner. The kids were roasting marshmallows, their faces glowing in the firelight. I wrapped an arm around her, trying to share in her contentment, but my eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond our little circle of light, searching for what? I didn't know. We sent the kids to bed around 9, tucking them into their sleeping bags with promises of hiking and swimming tomorrow. Sarah and I stayed up a bit longer, talking in low voices by the dying fire. "Are you okay, Jack?" she asked, concern etching her features. "You've seemed on edge all day." I hesitated, not wanting to worry her. "I'm fine, just tired from the drive, I guess." She didn't look convinced, but didn't push it. We doused a fire and crawled into our own sleeping bags, the silence of the night pressing in around us. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I heard it, a scream, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. "Jack!" Sarah mumbled sleepily beside me. "What's wrong?" "Shoo!" I whispered, straining my ears. There was again another scream, closer this time, followed by what sounded like someone crashing through the underbrush. Sarah was fully awake now, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" "I don't know," I said, already reaching for the flashlight we kept by our sleeping bags. "Stay here with the kids. I'm going to check it out." "Jack, no," she hissed, grabbing my arm. "We should call for help." I shook my head. "No cell service, remember? The ranger station is miles away. I'll just take a quick look around. Maybe someone's hurt and needs help." Before she could argue further, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night. The air was cool and damp, a light mist hanging between the trees. I switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw them, pinpricks of light moving through the trees, maybe a quarter-mile away. Flashlights. Someone was out there. I hesitated, torn between investigating and returning to the safety of our tent. But if someone was in trouble, making a decision, I started toward the lights, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush. As I got closer, I could hear voices low, urgent whispers that I couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, a twig snapped under my foot. The voices went silent, and the flashlights winked out, plunging the forest into darkness. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For several long moments, nothing moved. Then I heard it, footsteps, moving rapidly away from me. I raised my flashlight, desperate to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there, but all I saw were trees and mist. Shaken, I made my way back to our campsite. Sarah was waiting outside the tent, wringing her hands. "What happened? Did you see anything?" she asked as soon as I emerged from the trees. I hesitated, not wanting to frighten her more. There were some people out there with flashlights, probably just some other campers who got turned around in the dark. She didn't look convinced. But what about the screams? I shook my head. I didn't hear anything else. Maybe it was just an animal. We crawled back into the tent, but sleep was impossible now. We lay there in tense silence, listening to the sounds of the forest until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the tent walls. As soon as it was light enough, I stepped outside, determined to see if I could find any traces of the nighttime visitors. But the morning mist had erased any tracks that might have been left. The campground was as silent and empty as it had been yesterday. Sarah joined me outside, dark circles under her eyes. "Maybe we should pack up and go home," she suggested quietly. I was about to agree when Tommy stuck his head out of the tent. "Are we going swimming today, Dad?" The hope in his voice made my heart ache. We'd promised the kids this trip for months. Could I really take it away from them based on a night of strange noises? "Of course, buddy," I heard myself saying, right after breakfast. The day passed uneventfully. We swam in the lake, hiked a nearby trail, and roasted hot dogs over the fire for dinner. By the time night fell again, the events of the previous night felt like a bad dream. But as we were cleaning up after dinner, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, tucked under the windshield wiper of our car, was a piece of paper. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. The message was short, written in a hasty scrawl. "Leave immediately. You are in danger." I crumpled the note in my fist, my mind racing. Who had left this? When? I'd been by the car multiple times today and hadn't noticed anything. "Jack, what's that?" Sarah called from where she was helping the kids clean up. I shoved the note into my pocket. Nothing, just some trash. But as I turned back to my family, I knew we couldn't stay here another night. Whatever was going on in this campground, I wasn't about to risk my family's safety to find out. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "What do you guys think about packing up and driving home tonight? We could sleep in our own beds. Maybe hit that pancake place you kids love for breakfast tomorrow." The kids started to protest, but Sarah caught my eye. She must have seen something in my expression, because she quickly jumped in. "That sounds like a great idea. It'll be an adventure. Driving home in the dark." It took us less than an hour to break camp, our practice routine sped up by my sense of urgency. As we pulled out of the campground, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We were about a mile down the road when flashing lights appeared in my rearview mirror. A police car pulled up behind us, signaling for me to pull over. My hands were shaking as I rolled down the window. The officer approached slowly, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Everything all right, folks?" he asked, shining his flashlight into our car. "We got a report of some disturbances up at Whispering Pines. You coming from there?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yes, officer. We were camping there, but we decided to head home early." He studied me for a long moment, then glanced at Sarah and the kids. "You see or hear anything unusual up there?" I thought about the screams, the flashlights in the woods, the warning note. But looking at my family's tired, confused faces, I made a decision. "No, sir," I said firmly. "Everything was quiet. We just got a bit homesick, that's all." The officer nodded slowly. "All right then, you folks drive safe now." As we pulled away, Sarah turned to me. "Jack, what's really going on?" I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. I don't know, honey, but I think we just had a very close call. Let's just be grateful we're all safe. As we drove into the night, leaving Whispering Pines far behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something terrible. And I knew with absolute certainty that we would never be returning to that campground again. The image on my camera's screen made my blood run cold. There, in the grainy night vision footage, stood a figure I couldn't explain and certainly hadn't seen. But it was the timestamp that truly terrified me. 2:37 a.m. I'd been fast asleep in my tent, blissfully unaware of the silent watcher just feet away. I never should have come out here alone, but the allure of capturing the elusive mountain lion on film had been too strong to resist. Now, as I stared at the haunting image, I realized I might have stumbled upon something far more dangerous than any wild animal. It had all started 3 days ago. I'd taken a week off work, determined to get the perfect shot for my wildlife photography portfolio. The Cascade Mountains were known for their diverse ecosystem, and recent sightings of a mountain lion in the area had piqued my interest. I'd hiked deep into the wilderness, well off the beaten path. It was a risk, camping alone in such remote territory, but I'd convinced myself I was prepared. I had my tent, enough supplies for a week, and most importantly, my camera equipment, including a high-end motion-activated camera for nighttime shots. The first 2 nights had been uneventful. I'd captured some beautiful footage of deer, a family of raccoons, and even a black bear lumbering through my campsite in the early hours of the morning. But no mountain lion. Yesterday, I'd spent the day scouting for tracks and setting up my camera in what I hoped was a promising location. I'd found what looked like fresh paw prints near a small clearing about 100 yards from my tent, perfect for catching any nighttime visitors without disturbing them. I'd gone to sleep full of anticipation, hoping that tonight would be the night I'd finally catch a glimpse of my elusive quarry. Now, in the harsh light of morning, I wished I'd never set up that camera at all. My hands shook as I flipped through the night's footage. The first few hours showed nothing unusual, just the gentle sway of branches in the breeze, the occasional small animal scurrying past. Then, at 1:42 a.m., something changed. The leaves in the foreground rustled, as if disturbed by a gentle breeze. But the branches of the trees remained eerily still. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the grainy image. That's when I saw it, a dark shape emerging from the tree line. At first, I thought it might be the mountain lion I'd been hoping for. But as the figure moved into the clearing, my excitement turned to confusion, then to fear. It was humanoid in shape, tall and thin, but something about its movements was off. It didn't walk so much as glide, its motions too smooth, too deliberate to be natural. The figure paused at the edge of the clearing, its head turning slowly, as if surveying the area. Then, with a suddenness that made me flinch, it looked directly at the camera. I felt a chill run down my spine. Even in the grainy night vision footage, there was something deeply unsettling about its face. It seemed almost featureless, save for 2 dark hollows where eyes should be. For nearly an hour, the figure stood motionless, staring at the camera. Then at 2:37 a.m., it turned and began moving with that same unnaturally smooth gait, straight in the direction of my tent. The footage ended there, the next frame showing nothing but the empty clearing in the gray light of dawn. I lowered the camera, my mind reeling. What had I captured on film? A person? Some kind of animal? Or something else entirely? I glanced around my campsite, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The forest that had seemed so peaceful yesterday now felt oppressive, full of hidden dangers. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. I needed to get out of here, now. With shaking hands, I began to pack up my gear. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the video emerging from the trees. But the forest remained still, indifferent to my rising panic. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, a twig snapped loudly somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of my campsite, stood a man. He was tall and lean, dressed in the green uniform of a park ranger. Under different circumstances, his presence might have been reassuring, but after what I'd seen on the camera, I found myself taking an instinctive step back. "Everything all right, sir?" the ranger called out, his voice friendly but with an undercurrent of concern. We don't usually see many campers out this far. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Would he believe me if I told him about the figure on the camera? Or would he think I was just another city dweller spooked by the noises of the forest? "I'm fine," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just packing up to head home." The ranger nodded, but I could see him taking in my half-packed gear, the fear I was trying hard to conceal. "Mind if I ask what brought you out here? This isn't exactly a popular camping spot." I hesitated again, then decided a partial truth was better than an obvious lie. "I'm a wildlife photographer," I explained, gesturing to my camera equipment. "I heard there might be mountain lions in the area." The ranger's expression changed at that, a flicker of something, concern, fear, passing over his face. "Mountain lions, huh? Yeah, we've had a few sightings, but they usually stay well away from humans." He paused, seeming to debate with himself. Then he added, "Though I gotta say, we've had some strange reports from this area lately. Nothing confirmed, mind you, but enough to make us keep a closer eye on things." My heart rate, which had just begun to slow, picked up again. "Strange reports?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "What kind of reports?" The ranger shook his head. "Nothing specific. Just hikers saying they felt like they were being watched. A few claiming they saw something moving in the trees at night. Probably just their imaginations running wild. You know how it is out here in the dark." But the way he said it, the way his eyes darted around the clearing as he spoke, told me he didn't believe that any more than I did. I swallowed hard, my hand unconsciously moving to the camera hanging around my neck. Should I show him the footage? Would he have an explanation for what I'd seen? Before I could decide, the ranger spoke again. "Listen, why don't I give you a hand packing up? It's a long hike back to the trailhead, and it'll be dark soon. I'd feel better knowing you made it out safely." The relief I felt at his offer was almost overwhelming. "That would be great," I said, not even trying to hide my gratitude. "Thank you." As we worked to break down my camp, I debated whether to tell him about the video. But every time I thought about bringing it up, the word stuck in my throat. What if he demanded to see it? What if he confiscated my camera as evidence? The thought of losing the only proof I had of what I'd seen was somehow worse than keeping it to myself. We made good time on the hike out, the ranger setting a brisk pace. As we walked, he told me about the history of the area, pointing out various plants and animal signs. In any other circumstance, I would have been fascinated, but now I could only nod and make non-committal sounds, my mind still replaying the eerie footage. It was nearly sunset by the time we reached the trailhead where my car was parked. As I loaded my gear into the trunk, the ranger cleared his throat. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "I don't know what you might have seen out there, but if I were you, I'd think twice about coming back to this part of the forest, at least for a while." I looked at him, seeing the seriousness in his eyes. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing I can prove. Just be careful, all right? And maybe don't go spreading around any stories about what you might have seen. Some things are better left alone." With that cryptic warning, he turned and headed back towards the trail, soon disappearing into the gathering darkness. I stood there for a long moment, keys in hand, staring after him. Then I got in my car and started the engine, eager to put as much distance between myself and this forest as possible. As I drove home through the night, my mind kept returning to the figure on the camera. What had I really seen out there in the wilderness? And more importantly, what had seen me? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was certain. I would never look at the woods the same way again. And somehow, I knew that whatever I had encountered out there wasn't finished with me yet. This was just the beginning of a mystery that would haunt me for years to come. The forest had never felt so oppressive. As darkness fell, the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. We were lost, our phones were dead, and something was following us. With each snapping twig and rustling leaf, I became more certain. We weren't going to make it out of these woods tonight. It had all started as a simple day hike. My best friend Alex and I had been planning this trip for weeks. We'd both been stressed with work and needed to get away from the city for a while. The Oak Ridge Trail was supposed to be challenging but manageable, a 6-hour loop through some of the most beautiful scenery in the state. We set out early that morning, full of energy and optimism. The weather was perfect, warm sunshine filtering through the canopy, a light breeze keeping us cool as we climbed. We stopped often to take photos, marveling at the vibrant wildflowers and towering redwoods. By mid-afternoon, we should have been halfway around the loop, but as we paused to check the map, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Nothing looked familiar. The landmarks we'd been using to navigate, a distinctive rock formation, a small waterfall, were nowhere to be seen. "I think we missed a turn somewhere," Alex said, frowning at the map. "Maybe we should backtrack?" I checked my phone, hoping to use a GPS, but there was no signal. Alex's phone was the same. We were on our own. "If we go back now, we'll lose hours of daylight," I argued. "Look, there's a ridge up ahead. If we can get to higher ground, we might be able to spot the trail." Alex hesitated but nodded. "All right, but if we don't see anything familiar from up there, we turn back." "Deal." "Deal." I agreed, trying to ignore the nagging worry in the back of my mind. We pushed on, the terrain growing steeper and more challenging. By the time we reached the ridge, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon. The view was breathtaking, miles of unbroken forest stretching out before us. But there was no sign of the trail, no glimpse of the parking lot where we'd left our car. "We have to go back," Alex said, a note of panic creeping into their voice. "We can't be out here after dark." I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, you're right. Let's hurry." We started back down the way we'd come, moving as quickly as we dared over the uneven ground. But in our haste, we must have taken a wrong turn. Nothing looked familiar. The trees all blended together, each rock and fallen log indistinguishable from the last. As the last of the daylight faded, we were forced to admit the truth. We were hopelessly lost. "We should stop and make camp," I suggested, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's too dangerous to keep going in the dark. We can try to find our way out in the morning." Alex nodded, their face pale in the gathering gloom. We found a small clearing and set about gathering what supplies we could. Neither of us had packed for an overnight stay. We had some water, a few protein bars, and the clothes on our backs. It was going to be a long, cold night. As we worked to create a makeshift shelter from fallen branches, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes, I'd pause and scan the trees, sure I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the edge of my vision. But there was never anything there. We huddled together under our flimsy shelter, trying to conserve body heat. Neither of us spoke much, both lost in our own thoughts. I found myself straining my ears, listening for what? I wasn't sure, but something felt off. It was close to midnight when we heard it, a loud snap, like a branch breaking under a heavy weight. We both sat up, suddenly alert. "What was that?" Alex whispered, clutching my arm. "Probably just an animal," I said, but I didn't believe it. The sound had been too loud, too deliberate. We waited, barely breathing, listening intently. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. Then we heard it again, closer this time, and it was unmistakably footsteps. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. Is someone there? No response. Just more footsteps, circling our little clearing. Alex was trembling beside me. What do we do? They whispered. I swallowed hard, trying to think. Maybe it's a ranger or another hiker. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. No hiker or ranger would be creeping around in the dark like this. The footsteps continued, getting closer with each circuit of our camp. I could hear branches being pushed aside, leaves crunching underfoot. Whatever it was big. We need to move, I whispered to Alex. Grab what you can. We're getting out of here. We scrambled to our feet, snatching up our backpacks. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on. The weak beam did little to penetrate the thick darkness surrounding us. Which way? Alex asked, their voice tight with fear. I pointed in a random direction, away from where we'd last heard the footsteps. That way. Stay close to me. We set off at a brisk pace, trying to move quietly while still covering ground quickly. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as we half ran, half stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind us, I could hear the footsteps picking up pace. Whatever was following us, it was moving faster now. Run, I gasped, grabbing Alex's hand and pulling them along. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. The sound of pursuit grew louder, closer. I could hear heavy breathing now, not just our own panicked gasps, but something else, something wild and hungry. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. We'd run right off the edge of a steep embankment. We tumbled down the slope, a tangle of limbs and leaves, coming to a bruising stop at the bottom. For a moment, we lay there, stunned and winded. Then Alex tugged at my arm. Look, they whispered, pointing. Through the trees ahead, I could see a faint glow. Lights. Civilization. We scrambled to our feet, hope giving us a fresh burst of energy. But as we started towards the lights, we heard it again. Those heavy footsteps, now at the top of the embankment we'd fallen down. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. There, silhouetted against the night sky, was a massive shape. It was vaguely humanoid, but too tall, too broad to be a person, and its eyes, two pinpricks of red light, fixed directly on us. Run! I screamed, no longer caring about stealth. We crashed through the underbrush, driven by pure terror. The lights grew brighter, resolving into the shape of buildings. A small town, right on the edge of the forest. If we could just reach it. Behind us, I could hear our pursuer gaining ground. Its footsteps were thunderous now, shaking the earth. The sound of snapping branches and splintering would fill the air as it plowed through obstacles we'd had to go around. Just when I thought my legs would give out, we burst from the tree line. We were in someone's backyard, a manicured lawn stretching out before us, leading to a well-lit house. We didn't slow down, sprinting across the lawn and up to the back door. I pounded on it with all my might, shouting for help. The door flew open, revealing a startled-looking middle-aged man. What in the world? Dash, please, I gasped, pushing past him into the house. Let us in. There's something out there. Alex slammed the door behind us, leaning against it as if their weight could keep out the horror we'd just escaped. The man looked bewildered, but something in our terrified expressions must have convinced him we were serious. He quickly locked the door and drew the curtains. What happened to you two? He asked, taking in our scratched and muddy appearance. I opened my mouth to explain, but found I didn't have the words. How could I describe what we'd just experienced? A loud thud from outside made us all jump. Something heavy had just landed in the backyard. The man's eyes widened. He moved to the window, carefully peering out through a gap in the curtains. There's nothing there, he said after a moment, sounding confused. Just some disturbed grass, like something big took off in a hurry. I sagged with relief, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Whatever had chased us through the forest, it seemed unwilling to venture into the town. As the man called the local sheriff and got us some much-needed water, I caught Alex's eye. We didn't need to speak to know we were thinking the same thing. We'd escaped with our lives tonight, but we'd also learned a terrifying truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark places of the earth. And sometimes, when you venture into the wilderness, you find that you're not at the top of the food chain anymore. We never did find out what chased us that night. The official report chalked it up to an aggressive bear, despite the lack of any physical evidence. But Alex and I know the truth, and we'll never look at the forest the same way again. The moment he offered to share his campsite, I should have known something was off. But after hours of hiking with no end in sight, the promise of a warm fire and company was too tempting to resist. It wasn't until I was trapped in his web of lies that I realized the true danger I was in. I'd set out early that morning, determined to conquer the notoriously challenging Ridgeline Trail. The guidebook had warned it was a difficult 12-hour hike, but I was confident in my abilities. I'd been training for months, and my pack was filled with all the essentials, or so I thought. What I hadn't counted on was the unseasonably cold weather. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped rapidly. My lightweight jacket, perfect for a summer hike, did little to ward off the chill. I found myself shivering, my teeth chattering as I pushed on, desperately searching for a suitable campsite. That's when I saw the glow of a campfire through the trees. Relief washed over me as I approached, ready to ask for directions or advice on where I might set up my own camp nearby. Instead, I found him, a man probably in his mid-40s, sitting alone by the fire. He looked up as I entered the clearing, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Well, hello there," he called out, his voice friendly and inviting. "Looks like you had a long day on the trail." I nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted I was. Yeah, I underestimated the ridgeline. I was hoping to make it to Beaver Creek Campground, but I don't think that's happening tonight. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Beavercreek, you're way off course, friend. That's a good 10 miles east of here." My heart sank. How had I gotten so turned around? The man must have seen the dismay on my face because he quickly added, "Hey, no worries. Why don't you join me for the night? I've got plenty of space, and I was just about to heat up some dinner. I'm Tom, by the way." I hesitated for a moment, my natural caution warring with my desperate need for warmth and rest. In the end, exhaustion won out. "That would be amazing, thank you," I said, relief evident in my voice. "I'm Jack." Tom gestured for me to take a seat by the fire, and I gratefully sank down, holding my hands out to the flames. As the warmth slowly seeped back into my body, Tom busied himself with a small camping stove, heating up what smelled like beef stew. "So, what brings you out to these parts, Jack?" Tom asked as he stirred the pot. I launched into an explanation of my hiking goals, my training regimen, and how I'd clearly misjudged this particular trail. Tom listened attentively, nodding and asking questions at all the right moments. There was something almost hypnotic about his interest, and I found myself sharing more than I normally would with a stranger. As we ate the surprisingly delicious stew, Tom began to tell me about himself. He was a wildlife photographer, he said, out here hoping to capture some shots of the elusive mountain lions that roamed the area. "I've been tracking a particular female for days," he explained, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I think I'm close to finding her den. With any luck, there might be cubs." I was fascinated. "Isn't that dangerous?" I asked, thinking of the warnings I'd read about keeping your distance from wild animals. Tom waved a hand dismissively. "Nah, I know what I'm doing. Been working with big cats for years. Did a whole series on tigers in India a while back." As the night wore on, Tom regaled me with stories of his adventures around the world. He'd photographed polar bears in the Arctic, tracked gorillas in the mountains of Rwanda, and swam with great white sharks off the coast of South Africa. Each tale was more incredible than the last, and I found myself hanging on his every word. But as I listened, A niggling doubt began to form in the back of my mind. Some of the details didn't quite add up. He mentioned using digital equipment for a shoot in the 80s, long before such technology was widely available. He described an encounter with a now-extinct subspecies of rhino, claiming it happened just last year. At first, I brushed these inconsistencies aside. Maybe I had misheard, or maybe he was just mixing up dates. But as the discrepancies piled up, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in my gut. I decided to test the waters. "That tiger shoot in India sounds amazing," I said casually. "Which national park was that in again?" Tom's eyes flickered for just a moment before he answered smoothly, "Oh, it was in Ranthambore. Beautiful place." I nodded, my suspicions growing. I happened to know that Ranthambore National Park didn't allow the kind of close-up photography he had described, but I kept my face neutral, not wanting to let on that I'd caught him in a lie. As the night wore on, Tom's behavior became increasingly erratic. One moment he'd be laughing and joking, the next his eyes would go distant and cold. He'd trail off mid-sentence, staring into the darkness beyond our campfire with an intensity that made me shiver. I began to look for an opportunity to excuse myself, to retreat to my tent and put some distance between us. But every time I started to get up, Tom would launch into another story, his hand on my arm keeping me in place with a grip that was just a little too tight to be friendly. It was well past midnight when I finally managed to break away, claiming exhaustion. Tom's eyes followed me as I set up my tent on the far side of the clearing. I could feel his gaze boring into my back, and it took all my willpower not to show how unnerved I was. Inside my tent, I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest and Tom moving around the campsite. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Who was this man really? Why had he lied about so much? And most importantly, was I in danger? I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, it was dawn. I unzipped my tent cautiously, half expecting to find Tom waiting outside. But the clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to ashes, and there was no sign of Tom or his gear. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by confusion. Had I imagined the whole thing? But no, there was the pot we'd eaten stew from, and the log I'd sat on by the fire. It had all been real. As I packed up my own gear, still shaken by the night's events, something caught my eye. There, half hidden under a bush at the edge of the clearing, was a small leather wallet. My heart pounding, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was an ID card, but it wasn't for anyone named Tom. The photo showed a man who bore only a passing resemblance to my companion from the night before. The name on the card was William Hartley, and it was a patient identification card from a psychiatric hospital 2 states over. My blood ran cold as I read the information. William Hartley, diagnosed with severe paranoid schizophrenia and delusional disorder. Last seen 3 weeks ago after escaping during a supervised outdoor excursion. I dropped the wallet as if it had burned me, suddenly desperate to be as far away from this place as possible. As I shouldered my pack and turned to leave, movement in the trees caught my eye. For just a moment, I thought I saw a face watching me. Tom's face, or William's, twisted into a sinister grin. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just shadows and leaves stirring in the morning breeze. I didn't wait around to see if it had been real or just my imagination. I hit the trail at a near run, not caring which direction I was going as long as it was away from that clearing. It was mid-afternoon before I finally stumbled onto a ranger station. As I recounted my story to the skeptical-looking park ranger, I could see in his eyes that he didn't quite believe me, but he radioed it in anyway, promising they'd send out a search party to look for the missing patient. As I sat in the ranger's truck, being driven back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had a narrow escape. The wilderness held dangers far beyond what any guidebook could prepare you for. And sometimes, the most dangerous predators out there are the ones that look just like us. I never went camping alone again after that night. And to this day, whenever I'm in the woods and feel eyes watching me from the trees, I can't help but wonder, Is it just an animal? Or is Tom out there somewhere, spinning his web of lies, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to wander into his clearing?